Hello, boys and girls. This week, our story is called The Day Eddie Met the Author. The genre of this story is realistic fiction. That means that the story could have happened, but it didn't. It was made up. The setting is real, and the characters also behave like real people would behave. Tuesday, October 10th, was going to be a great day for Eddie and his class. It was the day a real author was coming to Riverside Elementary School. Eddie had been waiting. The whole class had been waiting, especially Eddie's teacher, Mrs. Morrow. She loved real authors. She loved how real authors made the words flow and how the words seemed just right and went with the pictures in their own way. Mrs. Morrow said she couldn't live without books and the wonderful stories in them. She said third graders had their own stories to tell. We are all authors with important stories inside us. Eddie chewed on his pencil and thought hard. How could his stories ever be like a real author's? Eddie had been reading. His whole class had been reading. 10 different books by the author who was coming to visit. In every one of those books, Eddie found a part that seemed just for him. Everyone in the class found their own parts in the books too. How does the author do that? Eddie asked Mrs. Morrow one morning as the bell rang for recess. That's a great question, Eddie, his teacher said. You'll have to ask her when she comes. Eddie wrote down his author question on a bright yellow piece of paper and put it in his desk, right on top of his ideas to write about notebook. That's a question you won't want to lose, Mrs. Morrow told him with her best smile. At last, the big day. Mrs. Morrow wrote Tuesday, October 10th on the chalkboard in her best cursive. Mrs. Morrow led the class to the gym. There was the real author. She was testing Mr. Ciccarella's microphone and getting ready for the assembly. Arthur was setting up chairs for the teachers. Eddie checked out the author from head to foot. He thought real authors would look different from everybody else. The author just looked like a teacher or a mom. Eddie sat between two of his classmates and he sat up straight. The author was wearing a vest that was a patchwork of pictures from some of her books. Eddie looked to find his favorite one. There it was. There were whispers in the audience. Then Mr. Ciccarella welcomed their special guest. No one in Mrs. Morrow's class talked or squirmed, not even Tyler Mason. Everyone was ready to listen, and the author began. I can tell you've all had your noses in my books. I've been reading your wonderful writing in the school hallways and seeing your terrific illustrations. Eddie sat up straighter. He was so proud of Riverside Elementary. Some of you may be wondering how to become a writer. The best way to become a writer is to be a reader. Eddie was a reader. The author was talking about him. The minutes of the assembly zoomed by. Eddie never wanted it to end. Today, he felt like a real writer. Finally, it was time for questions and answers. Eddie put his hand up fast as lightning, but there were other hands in front of him and behind him and on both sides of him. Everyone wanted the author to call on them. Eddie waved his yellow paper in the air. His question was important. Mrs. Morrow had said it was not a question to lose. How long have you been a writer? How old are you? Do you ever run out of ideas? How old are your kids? Have you autographed our books yet? Which book is your favorite book? Which book was hardest to write? And there's Eddie with his question. No one asked the question that Eddie wanted answered, but the assembly was over and Eddie hadn't been called on. Mr. Ciccarella began to dismiss the second and third graders. Eddie's question. His important question on the most exciting day of the school year. He wanted to know the answer. Eddie read the words he had written on his yellow paper. Slowly, Eddie folded up the question and put it back in his pocket. Suddenly, he felt a grown-up's hand on his shoulder. But it wasn't Mrs. Morrow or Mr. Ciccarella. It was the author. She was standing right next to Eddie in the third grade line, asking him his name. Then she said, I saw your hand up in the assembly waving a yellow paper. I knew you had an important question to ask, but we ran out of time. The third graders began to crowd around Eddie and the author. Mrs. Morrow shushed everyone as the author unfolded the yellow paper and read Eddie's words out loud. Now that is a thinking question, Eddie, the author said. Her smile was like a big warm hug. Eddie felt as tall as a grown-up standing in his third grade line. Everyone was quiet while the author put her hand on her chin and thought about Eddie's question. Maybe everyone was thinking about the parts of the author's books that seemed like they were meant just for them. That's what Eddie was thinking about. Then the author said, Eddie, if you ever write about parts of yourself, I bet your reader will have some of those parts too. I guess that's a small answer to the big question you asked. And by the way, I've always loved the name Eddie. Someday I may use it when I'm writing a book. Eddie looked at Mrs. Morrow and gave her a wide smile. Now maybe his stories could be like the author's, and he would try to write from his heart. On the afternoon of Tuesday, October 10th, Eddie began a rough draft of a new story during Mrs. Morrow's writing workshop. He didn't know how it would end, but he had plenty to write about from what had happened that day. He already knew a title to use. He'd written it in his notebook as soon as he got back to the classroom. The Day I Met the Author by Eddie Lewis, Grade 3.